And we are live.
Welcome, everybody. This is Matt Seifer from the Steer Center for Global Real Estate. We're going to get started here in a minute or two. We're just letting everybody filter in here. So appreciate everybody being here. We're up to 38 so far. So we're going to let this roll for a little bit here as people join, but we'll certainly get started momentarily. Thank you again for being here. Those who are just joining, we are pausing for a moment here to wait for everybody to join. It's 12:32. We'll get started here shortly, but want to give it a minute and let everybody join in here. Welcome, everybody. We're just waiting a moment here before we get started. We'll be started in a moment. All right, let's go ahead and get started here. We're at 12:33, and I think our participants sort of slowed to a trickle in terms of those coming in. So welcome, everybody. My name's Matt Seifer, the director of the Steer Center for Global Real Estate. Couldn't be happier to be with you today as part of the McBride Family Lecture Series. We have a great conversation today with a great speaker, Olivier Elamine, on the environmental leadership in the office REIT. And I had the pleasure of hearing Olivier speak several weeks ago, maybe a month or two ago, and it was extraordinarily insightful, provocative, and interesting, which is exactly why he's here again. And we're doing it in the context of the McBride Family Lecture. And historically, pre-COVID, if you will, the McBride Family Lecture was a student-only lecture series as endowed by the McBride family. And given the circumstances that we find ourselves in the virtual environment, in the reality of the speaker that we have and the quality of the speaker, we thought this year we would expand that to include our family outside of Georgetown, whether it be Steer Center board members or alumni or whatnot. So we're very, very pleased to have everybody here. I have the pleasure of introducing Tim McBride. And Tim is the chairman and CFO of McBride Enterprises. Tim is a JD alum. He also got his LLM from the law school and is a proud parent of a Hoya. Tim has been a regent here at Georgetown. And for those of you that are in my Finance 220 class, which hopefully is a lot of you on this call, Tim really is one of the three individuals who are responsible for us even being here today with the Steer Center for Global Real Estate. It's really Tim, Bob Billingsley, and Bob Steers that essentially were the kindling that got this thing started. And really, Tim put his what do they say? Walk the talk, and he walked the talk by being one of the instructors in the undergraduate program. He taught Finance 220 for a long time. And frankly, I think the story goes as he saw what was being taught on the syllabus and said he could do better, and did, and got put in as the instructor for the class. And as they say, the rest is history. So we owe a lot to him and his family. And we're thrilled for him to be here. So he and his family have endowed this lecture series that we do at least once a year, if not twice. And it's really one of the highlights of our academic year. And I'd like to offer Tim McBride an opportunity to offer a couple thoughts.
This is Tim. Are we live?
Yep.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Matt. That's a very flattering introduction. And so you took half of my speech. But seriously, I'm very pleased to be here, and I've been pleased with how this program has evolved on many levels, including the lecture series. And Matt has added a lot of value to the whole process, and we're very grateful for that. Most of my family members are up in New Jersey, and I've invited them each time we have this, and they're busy people as well, mostly in real estate, a little bit of golf. And I've usually been the one, and I'm happy to do the speaking here a little bit. And I really enjoyed I think 15 semesters that I taught the real estate program, first with Brian Gill and then later with Matt. So this kind of involvement at Georgetown has just been a blessing, and happy to continue helping as much as I can. I'm not getting any younger. But let me just tell you, and welcome to our special guests. Thank you for being here. I think the origin of this series is pretty clear now. So let me tell you why the McBrides are involved here. We had a kind of a unique growth of our business, starting with my grandfather, believe it or not, in 1898 as a plumber with a wagon in Paterson, New Jersey. And as he got older, his three sons actually, particularly Nevins McBride, you'll see his name scattered around the Georgetown community, but he sort of got the real estate aspect of our business going, where my dad and my grandfather thought of it more as a plumbing business. So it grew dramatically, and the Second World War was going on, and we got a number of jobs as a consequence of that. But once that all settled down, we began to think, and I was pretty young at this point, we began to think about the future and what do we do with what we own. And Nevins had expanded us into real estate dramatically, and we bought some land, and we began doing build-to-suits. But in those cases, we were selling the property, though, as part of the deal. And I kept saying, and I was learning something about real estate law as a student, and I said, maybe we should try to hold on to these properties and rent them instead of selling them, because we're giving away the future. And that eventually caught on, but we had to make a living, so we couldn't exactly do the best thing at the time. But we began to think that the future for the family should be weighted toward real estate. The labor issues with construction were difficult and getting more difficult, and we had a growing family, and real estate was starting to reach the headlines. So I was part of a team. I was the CFO for quite some time, and I had the tax background. So I persuaded the family to really think hard about the long term and how to sustain the family at some economic level, but at the same time, be prudent in the business decisions. My grandfather started as a plumber in 1898, and it was a good example to everyone because he worked very hard, and in his own way, he was very successful. What we began to think, though, particularly with my tax background, is what about the future, and how do we manage the future for the family? How do we diversify? How do we create cash flow? How do we give opportunities to family members, particularly in the case of death? How do we deal with paying death taxes? And one thing led to another, and I began to read up on REITs as a strategy, which may or may not cover some or all of these questions that we were asking. And I began to travel around the East Coast, going to seminars put on by some of the bankers and learning about it, in addition to just the pure tax stuff. And I began to say, we should try to get involved somehow with this REIT world and see what we can do. Well, we made efforts to sell our portfolio to people that were entrepreneurs, or possibly even going to Wall Street and see if a banker would back us. And I could name some of the folks that that kind of chuckled at us because we just weren't attractive enough or large enough. So they said, come back when you get more assets. So we were lucky enough to run into a very talented and hardworking guy based out of Philadelphia named Jeff Kelter. And we began to accumulate other families to the point where we had, if memory serves me, 5, possibly 6 families that were pretty much in the same boat we were in. Ironically, I said, why why don't we buy a REIT instead of fighting the underwriters and all the complexity of that? And just so it turned out that one of the fellows we were speaking with said, we know some folks that went to the trouble of setting up a REIT, and they aren't satisfied with the outcome because they were small, number one, and these guys are entrepreneurs. They didn't want to waste time with, all the various paperwork you have to do in a public company. So we attracted them into our area, and pretty soon we merged all the properties into this company. It was called, it was a Pennsylvania, I'll think of the name in a moment, but it was put us on the screen, but we weren't very impressive. But over the course of about 3 or 4 more years, I was told that we became the #1 small cap REIT in the industrial area, which was pretty good. So we got a little visibility that way. The long and short of it is, though, that we naturally had different priorities set up with our different major partners. And, we were functioning, we had dividends, we did all the filings we had to do with the SEC and everybody. But at the end of the day, we said, where's this going? And because I said that we were sort of like the Seabiscuit of the REIT world, because, if you remember the quote out of that movie, the horse was too small, the jockey was too big, and the guy that was coaching was too old. But obviously Seabiscuit stuck in there and did well. And we sort of had a similar sort of hard scrabble history. But the numbers were great, and we were eventually approached by Prologis. We got large enough and clean enough, from the books and the disciplines we had. And sure enough, Prologis acquired the assets at that point, actually the REIT. And now some of us had done some planning, and my own philanthropic planning was part of this, because we had a time from the time that we announced that this was probably going to happen to closing the deal. And so Georgetown became a beneficiary of that whole process. But the REIT is no longer owned directly by the family. It's publicly owned by Prologis, and the family gained some diversification and flexibility in their planning going forward. So I felt, from where I started from some 20 or 25 years earlier, thinking about it, I felt we really had done a win-win, and we should be happy with it and move forward. And Georgetown has been very, very accommodating. I was very happy to join Bob Steers and Bob Billingsley and many others later, including Matt, to sort of get back here and enjoy it. Plus, I live in Washington, so it wasn't too hard to drive down the hill to Georgetown. Although I always had to pay for my own parking. Sorry about that, but it's been a great privilege. And I'm sort of in the waning years of my life, but I was happy to get back into this at Matt's invitation. I'm very proud of everything he's doing and what we've all accomplished. So I hope that is a good enough introduction, Matt.
That's great, Tim. Thank you so much, brother. I appreciate you, man. I appreciate what you and your family have done for us. So thank you. All right, so let's get on with the show here. So I'm going to try to get this over with quickly so we can get on to the meat of the conversation. So very quickly, by way of background here, in November of 2019, the Steers Center had what we call a Project Skyhook, which was a 2-day, 60 alumni person event where we thought about who do we want to be, what do we want to be, and how do we want to do it? What's the future state of the Steers Center? And from that, of which many of you participated in, we got really great feedback and thoughts on our strategic direction. And from that, one of the directions was the Steers Center needs to lean in heavy in the areas of ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And we've really been executing on that with the start of the fall semester. And today, in today's lecture, is E to the fullest extent. And so, for those that are on the call that were at Project Skyhook, this is your time and effort playing out here. I wanted to quickly share my screen, and I want to then, before I introduce our speaker here, I want to basically just quickly share something that hopefully will set the tone of the conversation. And these slides came from the Smith Group, which is an architecture firm that we're involved with in some other capacities. But when everybody thinks about climate change, I think when a lot of people think about climate change, they think about automobiles, they think about industry. But what they fail to think about is the sizable influence that buildings have in the built environment. So you can see here, this is just the United States in terms of US energy consumption and emissions. And you can see the role that we as a real estate community play and the responsibility we have to our environment and to the global community. And then if you think about the fact that over the next 35 years, 2 trillion square feet of new and rebuilt buildings will be constructed in the cities worldwide, it really puts into context how important the built environment is to this whole climate change conversation. And then finally, what I found fascinating that we're going to spend time talking about today is a lot of our conversation about sustainability deals with the building after it's built. And that's great, right? But this whole CO2 element that occurs in construction is arguably the worst as part of the life cycle of a building, which is known as embodied carbon. It's essentially the carbon that's emitted in the construction process. And so I frankly had not even heard of that term 6 months ago. And frankly, Olivier really is the one who brought it to my attention in the first place. But it's really interesting, and especially in light of the 2 other slides that we talked about. And so our conversation today is with Olivier Elamine, who's the CEO of Alstria Office REIT. He's also the co-founder, by the way. It's the largest German office REIT, 116 buildings, 161 million square feet, total asset value of 5.3 billion. And just some background on Alstria. They were the first German real estate company to publish a sustainability report. 100% of their electric comes from renewable sources. They famously said, at least in European circles, I'd not heard this in the United States, back in October of 2009, that the most sustainable building is the building that was never built. So consequently, Alstria does very little in the way, or none in the way of greenfield development. They're very focused on improving the existing stock, adaptive reuse, but they're doing it while still being able to, make and preserve their financial returns. And they also recently came out with something known as the green dividend, which I'm going to have Olivier speak to in a bit. But I'm going to stop talking here and we're going to get to Olivier here. So Olivier, thank you so much for being here. I know it's sort of later in your day over there, but appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Matt. That's a pleasure of being able to speak to a young graduate and the future generation of real estate. I'm very happy to be here today. Awesome.
Well, the 2 of us shared some questions. For those in the audience, if you have questions, you can load them via the Q&A aspect of the of our webinar here. But let's get you started, Olivier, with could you give us a little bit of background of who you are, your own personal background, because that really plays into your views on the built environment and sustainability.
Sure. So I'm a civil engineer by training. So I basically start my professional career working in concrete, and actually started working in a lab, which was testing different kind of concrete. So I have some kind of like 20-year-old understanding of how the physics and the chemistry in the construction industry works. And then it's only later on that I moved into real estate. I actually started as a consultant then with Ernst & Young at the time, and I was doing some environmental work. I was one of the first 3 young consultants recruited by Ernst & Young in Paris to do environmental work back in the 1990s. And at that time, you could not make a living with environmental, so I ended up in real estate. You know, and life eventually brought me to a situation where I ended up founding a German REIT, which was focusing on offices. And obviously initially we were immediately very focused on the environmental topic. And that was to a certain extent, not only driven by my background, but also driven by what we felt the opportunity was in the marketplace, where you had in Europe, at least, all the stock of offices, which was, you know, 40, 50-year-old and needed to be retrofitted and refurbished. And we felt that was a tremendous opportunity. It was cheaper to turn an old building into a new building than build a new one. There were a lot of people who were owning those old buildings and didn't have the capital or the capacity to do this. So, you know, we found equity within private equity firms. We started buying assets in Germany, and then in 2007, right before the great financial crisis, we ended up listing the company here in Frankfurt Stock Exchange.
Okay, so we appreciate that. So, you know, obviously your background on the engineering side and with concrete is important to this. And I'll share some really quick stats with the audience here. So cement is the second most utilized substance in the world, second only to water, which is also a key component to cement. And it's arguably the most carbon emitting aspect of the whole embodied carbon component of the construction industry. So your background in cement and in the greenhouse gas emission elements of that were really sort of fundamental, I suspect, to your sustainability views. So, I mean, can you walk us forward a little bit with how the sustainability background and your views on that really played into Alstria? Because that I've heard you say that you see climate change as the #1 concern for the impact to your business long term. So, you know, can you maybe talk a bit more about that?
So maybe, I mean, to spend 2 minutes, and I don't want to get too technical here, but to spend 2 minutes on cement itself, I think it's important for your student to bear in mind if they're going to be in real estate their whole career, is cement, the CO2 which is generated by cement is not only generated by the fact that there's not an energy that goes into cement. The chemical reaction that happened to create the cement is releasing CO2. Actually, half of the CO2, which is produced when you produce cement, is coming from that reaction. So even if you use the cleanest energy possible, there is no physical way today to produce cement without emitting a massive amount of CO2. There is just none. This is basic chemistry in essence. And therefore, as soon as you build a building, there is no way around emitting a massive amount of CO2. And as you said, it's the second most used after water. And the reason why it's used and the reason why our industry uses it so much is because it's readily available, it's extremely cheap, it's not very difficult to manufacture, it can be manufactured almost everywhere on the world. And it's extremely resistant, it works very well. And it's extremely resistant when it's combination with steel, which is also another process which is emitting a lot of CO2. So when you look at all those elements and put them together, you come to the conclusion that, you know, whenever you're going to be building a new building, the amount of CO2 you need to issue, or the amount of material you need to use, is going to be massive, and it's going to drop massively whatever saving you can do in the future, because your building is more efficient than a standing one. When we were back in 2008, I mean, I actually took a trip in a country in the Middle East on a roadshow, and we were driving around the city, and there was so many empty buildings, and those buildings were all LEED certified. I mean, they were all LEED Gold and LEED Platinum, etc. And this is where we came up with the view that, I mean, there was so much material used there, and they were used to build buildings that were literally empty and that have been empty for years. And this is where we thought, you know, maybe it would have been more sustainable not to build those buildings. And maybe, you know, the most sustainable building is the one that you didn't have to build, because you don't necessarily need to do that. It is kind of counterintuitive when you're a real estate person, because as a real estate guy, you want to build. And this is what we are trained to do. But there's also an economic reason. And when we argue this, at least within alstria's board, and when we're arguing with our investor, who tell us, how come you don't do greenfield development? We also say, as an asset owner, as an owner of the land, I have also a vested interest in not building much more than that. Because if you look at the history of real estate, all the crises, they always come from overbuilt. So if you limit your stock, you create some kind of scarcity in the business. There should be a vested interest for all the REIT in every city in which we're investing, not to be pursuing construction that would just increase the value of our assets. So it's not only a show of good heart to a certain extent and a focus on environmental, but we think there's a real business rationale for not to overbuild in the city in which we are. Again, that goes against how we trained as real estate people. You train to be a developer, and you try to make your money by training the asset. But there is, I believe, a very strong case that can be made into not building so much, retrofitting as much of the existing stock, and being relatively successful. That's what we've been doing here in Germany for quite a while.
So that's great, Olivier. Thank you. And one of the questions that I had for you when we first talked, which I thought was interesting, is, again, you stated that you view climate change as the top threat to your business. And in the US, we're like, well, I don't think Germany's on the coast. And I've not heard much in the way of fires associated with Germany. So how is climate change the #1 threat to your business in Germany?
So we did what I think is requested from us by most of the investors, and we run all our assets through different scenarios of how climate change would impact our asset, whether we would have stranded asset, yes or no. And the answer is exactly as you said. I mean, I think the worst case scenario, you take RCP 8.5, which is really like a doomsday scenario in climate change. Some of our assets might be flooded from time to time. So really nothing monstrous. But, and this is also the way we answer to the TCFD, so the Climate Change Disclosure Project. We believe that climate change is going to impact economics across the globe. If Daimler, which is one of our tenants, cannot sell car in India or in China because cities are flooded over there, if there are massive migration, and we've been through a wave of migration in Europe a few years ago, if there is massive climate refugees, it will impact the economy, and as such, it will impact us. So we can, of course, just focus on what's going to happen around us and what's going to happen around our assets. But this is, from my perspective, a very short-sighted story. I don't think we're going to be very, very successful if half of the world where our clients are actually making their profit, our tenants are making their profit, I mean, those become inhabitable, and there is no way they can do business there. So, I mean, this is really our main concern. It's not so much for our assets, but it's more about, how are we going to be able to trade collectively in a world which is just collapsing because of climate change problem. And yes, it might happen thousands miles away from where we are, but the economic impact is going to be felt where we are. And again, we look back 2 or 3 years ago when there was a wave of refugees in Europe, arguably for a different reason than climate change. I mean, there was a lot of stress in the system. And this is clearly was just a warning shot from what's going to come later if we don't act.
So a question that really just came to me listening to you is, I'm curious, when you are leasing space in your buildings, do you evaluate the business of the individual tenants to see their susceptibility to climate change, much like what you just said? And does that impact your thoughts on leasing to certain tenants?
Not really. I would be lying to you otherwise. We don't do that. But it's not. I mean, now that you phrase it this way, it's probably not a bad idea to be looking at it. We do. I mean, we do look at other type of. I mean, we're careful not necessarily to rent to certain type of industry, etc. But it's not necessarily directly linked to climate change.
Got it. The other things that you have said, which I find really interesting, is you're sort of a critic of these, sustainability phrases like net zero and green buildings and things that we're sort of programmed over here maybe to think of as somewhat of a gold standard from a sustainability perspective. And I would love you to spend some time talking about that if you would.
I think we can look at the green building and then the net zero in two different circumstances. I mean, the green building, the reason why we are very, and this is maybe a European view, I don't know if it's similar in the US, but the reason why we're very skeptical about the green building is because the green building concept is to compare a building that doesn't exist with a theoretical building that also doesn't exist. So you're basically comparing yourself to a model, and you're only doing this comparison at the time of the design, and there is no check of the actual performance of the building when it's actually in operations. So you end up having a green LEED platinum building, and you have a number of those which are going to be not performing neither worse nor better than a regular building, which is not a green building. And there are additional costs that goes into that certification. And so we usually see limited value into those costs. And I know there are studies that tend to demonstrate that, but my argument has always been that those studies are just starting from the result and then back engineering the data to get to that result. Our experience is, and I had that experience a number of times with tenants who tells you, look, we need to have a green building. And then you ask them, what do you need? You need to be LEED Platinum, LEED Gold, DGNB, which is the German standard, or BREEAM, which is the UK standard. And they just say, look, I don't care. As long as it's green, I need to tick a box and send it away. And so whenever we certify a building, we basically use the certification that cost us the minimum amount of money. Because it's a pure marketing thing. We know that the actual efficiency of the building is not going to be neither better nor worse if we do a green building or if we simply follow the building code that we have down here. So we were very much reluctant basically to spend the extra money just to get a stamp on a paper saying that this building is green, and we're much more, would rather spend the money on something which effectively is going to improve the quality of the building. On the net zero, I think this thinking is kind of similar. I mean, my view is you cannot build a building without emitting CO2. And there is a danger into making people believe that it's possible. When you start to argue about net zero, I mean, I have to explain to my board that we cannot build a building without CO2. And the reason why I need to explain that to them is because they hear everywhere around me that people are building net zero buildings. And politicians, they hear that it's possible to build building without CO2 because they understand what they hear in net zero is that the fact there is no CO2 being emitted. And I think that's dangerous because if we are not aware of the fact that we're polluting, when I speak with Alex, who's my fellow board member, and we discuss about climate change, we say we should not be believing in our own lies. If we start to believe that if we don't know that we're polluting, if we ignore the fact that we're polluting and that we're emitting CO2, we're not going to be able to address the problem. And so we're very much defending the concept of low carbon. So we need to reduce carbon in the design and the build as much as we can, but we shy away from the net zero. We don't believe that offsetting is the right approach. We don't believe, actually, I believe it's just spending money on the wrong things, and that can lead us to the green dividend discussion. And so we think we need to look at things as they are and not as we wish them to be. And that's a fundamental element of being able to address the problem. If we just pretend and use words that do not reflect the reality, then at one stage, those words are going to become the reality, and we're going to just fail into what we're trying to do. I do believe that semantic is a very, very important thing, and that calling things with the right name is going to be very important at the end of the day. There is no technology today that would allow you to build a building without emitting CO2. There is no such a thing as a net zero building. It just doesn't exist. In physics, it exists in marketing and works very well, but in physics, it doesn't exist.
Well, and I think that's been very effective here in the United States from a marketing perspective, and I'm sure others would maybe disagree with me, but in Europe, is your opinion that the tenants are more savvy to the marketing versus the realities? So as an example, are environmentally minded tenants seeking out you and Alstria Buildings because of your viewpoints on this? I know we have a community in the United States called the B Corp community, which is a collection of companies that are just very focused on sustainability, and they might be more inclined to locate somewhere with somebody that is authentically sustainable or as sustainable as possible. Do you find tenants actively seeking out your building and your product?
We find that our position on sustainability has more influence on our shareholders and more active in our investor relation activities than it is on the market. I mean, first of all, because the market doesn't necessarily hear about our positions and we don't necessarily speak about them. And when it comes to marketing, we also do marketing as well as anybody else. So if a tenant needs to have a green building certificate, we're going to give him a green building certificate. There's really no problem with that. What's happening now in Germany is I think most of the tenants have understood that they're not getting a better building for a green building, and they're paying more for it because obviously we're charging them for the fact that it's a green building. So I think they're also getting away of the certification story and moving back into the actual efficiency. What our tenants, for instance, like and what we do for them is, you mentioned we power all our building with renewable electricity. And in doing that, we actually reduce our electricity costs by almost 200% because, so we by 2/3 in essence. Because we were buying electricity, I don't know how it's done in the US, but in Germany, where basically every building has its own contract. The same way you power your apartments. So we would just went to the local electricity company, and then we were taking a contract. And then we moved that to a professional procurement process where we're buying electricity bulk on the market. And now we go back to our tenants and we offer them to buy at the same price than what we're paying, which is a fraction of what they're getting from the local electricity team. And the more tenants join us, the bigger is our buying power on the market. So the lower are the prices that we get. And this is more the kind of things tenants are interested in right now, much more than, you can have them like a green building certificate and a plant and a painting in the entrance of the building. So the savvy tenants are more looking at those kind of services rather than as a stamp on a piece of paper.
So you brought up your investors. Can you talk about the investor reception here, and maybe even a bit about the educational process associated with that? I mean, what's the investor community's response?
I mean, as you mentioned before, we've been publishing a sustainability report since 2010. I think it took me probably 4 years to get a single question on a roadshow about sustainability. It started essentially with a number of Dutch-based pension funds, which were the first to be really aware and focusing on this discussion. Those are the people who funded GRESB, which you're probably familiar with. And then as years started to pass, there was more and more focus on the ESG topic, and the environmental topic came at the forefront. Today, I think in each and every meeting I have, I do get a question on ESG. My feeling is in the investment community right now, there is still, I mean, they started basically 10 years after we did. So we're still kind of 10 years ahead of where they are. And there's also like a different shade of gray in the investor you're speaking to. Some of them are kind of ticking the box and some of them are taking it more seriously. But there are a number of very interesting discussions happening right now on investor really trying to tackle and understand how to approach this. And there are more and more people which are looking at the embodied carbon discussion we just had before, which was completely ignored 4 or 5 years ago, where you were speaking about it, people were just looking at you and asking what you're talking about. But you start to see now more companies coming out and saying, we're not gonna do greenfield, we're only gonna retrofit. You have a number of companies in London who have announced that recently. And you start to have a number of investors which are also pushing that on their investment base. So I think it's moving in the right direction. And we're seeing more traction in that field. I mean, want to speak briefly about the green dividend, but we basically asked our shareholder a very simple question, which was we offer them to take an additional cents of dividend, which is not a lot, but still 1 cent on 52 cents that we're paying, or to leave the money with us, and we would investing into a non-yielding project that would improve the decarbonation of the portfolio. So the question we were basically asking them was, are you willing to sacrifice some returns in order to help the company decarbonize faster than what we're currently doing? The answer was 95% of our shareholder actually decided to get the dividend paid, and not to go through the decarbonization. And I think that's also for me a very interesting question. You have all the discussion about governance in the US and in Germany as well. You know, should you maximize shareholder value? Is it about stakeholder value? And we'll just ask a simple question: which one it is? And the answer was very, very clear. It's shareholder value. I got actually very interesting comments, and a number of people were telling me, why are you even asking the question? Why aren't you just doing it? You don't need to ask a question to it, which is probably true. I could just go out and do the project without asking the shareholder. But the only reason why you don't ask a question is because you're afraid of the answer. And we wanted to have the answer. I think it's important that we hear as management that we hear this answer. This is not what our shareholder want us to do, and that's all fine by me. But entering into this dialogue and having companies asking shareholder question, and not only shareholder asking company to report numbers, I think this is the way forward to be able to address the sustainability issue, because again, it's not linked to us as a company, it's a more global thing. Our view is if we're the only one to act, it's just a waste of time and energy, because we can't solve the problem alone. So we need at one stage to gather a larger crowd who is following and trying to reach for the same targets. And what we try to do as much as possible is to do that in those conversations with them and with those kind of initiatives.
So you talk about expanding the scale of the folks that are worrying about this, and our experience in the conversations we've had within the Steer Center is that Europeans are much more focused on the environmental issues than maybe in the US. Can you talk about other CEOs? What's the conversation that you're having with them, whether it's other office REITs or other property types in general? Is anybody embracing some of this similar views that you have there or not?
I think, I mean, we have put together in Europe a think tank of 6 now European REITs. Us in Germany, there's a REIT in Italy, one in Spain, one in France, one in the UK, and one in Sweden. And we meet on a quarterly basis, and we discuss about a number of things. And probably 60% of the time in our discussion revolves today around sustainability. And we discuss about, trying to exchange information, try to do pilot project together. We try to, I mean, the Sweden company in our group have been building one of the first wood building, like fully wood construction building in Sweden. And so we try to get their feedback. We have run focus groups where we're asking a younger generation, what are the expectations for the office in the future? And the feedback we got from those focus groups, so those are not survey, those are focus groups, the same way you would do it for consumer product. And one of the main feedback is that there's going to be a massive focus on the sustainability aspect and the impact on climate change. So, I mean, by no means we are being unique in what we're doing. There are a substantial number of companies that are doing this. We tend to have, as a company, more radical views. So what I just said about net zero, I don't know if a lot of companies would share our views, and to not using the term at all, and actually being proud of not using it. But I think the dynamic here in Europe is very much that everybody is moving toward and insisting now and looking very deeply into all those aspects, because we believe those are going to be fundamental for the next 20, 25 years. If you want to survive as a real estate company, there's no way you can ignore those things, which actually falls very well in what you said in introduction, that, organizations like yours make ESG a fundamental part of your curriculum. I think that's completely in line with what we're seeing here in Europe.
So you brought up the term timber, and timber-built buildings, and in some of my preliminary experience, those are being offered as sort of alternatives to the embodied carbon issue, or somewhat of an offset to the conversation of embodied carbon. And in some respects, they sort of talk about the carbon sequestration that occurs because you're effectively locking wood up in a building forever, theoretically, and it sort of locks carbon. Would you be more open to that from a new development perspective, were that to evolve over time and see viability as sort of a, an answer to some of the new construction issues?
I think timber is a very, very interesting technology, and it's something we're looking into in a lot of details right now, and looking at how we can incorporate it within our thinking. But I don't think it's the answer, because I can't remember your slide. You said there's 2.5 trillion square feet of buildings that need to be done. I mean, there is not enough timber to actually fit that. So for the time being, it's more like it's nice, but it's not going to bring you the answer to the problem. The reason why we're looking into timber is that if there are limitations in the embodied carbon that you can put in a building, and in Europe it's probably more likely than in the US that at one stage government wake up one morning and say you cannot have more than 300 kilograms per square meter for a new building of embodied carbon. And then we will need to use timber. And the reason why we're looking at it right now is because we believe that at one stage, and this would be a fundamental change in our industry, for the first time for years, for centuries to a certain extent, we will be dependent on scarce resources to be able to build. So you're replacing cement, which is, as you said, readily available everywhere, cheap, by something which by definition is not going to be available to everybody. And what we're thinking about is, does it make sense at one stage to basically secure access to that resources? Is it in the best interest of the company to do that? And we're looking at trying to understand how timber REIT in the US work, because you have a much better structured market than what we have here in Europe. And we're looking to understand how the timber value chain works, and also to buy some forest to try and see how it works by ourselves. But if what you mentioned is going to be the future, and timber is going to replace cement at a future stage, then as an industry, we need to review a number of things, how we're thinking and how we're designing building. There is a very interesting study, and I encourage all your students to look at it, which has been produced a few weeks ago by the UK Green Building Council, where they basically took an existing building, one residential and one office building, and then they tried to rebuild it as a net zero building, essentially using timber. And it's very, very interesting to see the impact that this have on the layout, the fact that they cannot build as many floors as they expected because timber is big, wider than concrete or steel, so they were losing one floor on a 22-story building. They need to put more column in the building, so the layout is less flexible from a tenant perspective. And it's a fascinating study, because what's interesting in it is the dissonance of the author of the studies. They were trying to do a study to show that net zero is possible and is economically viable. And at the end of the study, they realized that actually they're losing one floor. It's going to be substantially more expensive. And in order to do that, they cannot have the kind of air conditioning that they have in the standard building. So the tenant will need to pay more rent for a building which has probably a lower quality in terms of services and air conditioning, etc. And you can read the dissonance in their conclusion. It is a fascinating story about timber, and it's available online on the UK Green Building Council website. So I really encourage you to look into that.
Well, it's interesting that you brought up sort of the tenancy element of this, and part of what I'm learning is to try to get to some level of net zero, or whatever you want to call it, a high degree of sustainability. You need to have the commitment of tenants from the standpoint of the plug loads, for instance, and the things that the computers and the personal items that are simply plugged into the walls that are a significant consumer of electric, right? So it's also agreeing to, you know, run the temperature a little warmer in the summer and a little colder in the winter. And so there's an element of just your own personal comfort and sort of what you're willing to accept as a tenant to really commit to doing this, which I think is interesting.
So in Germany, I mean, the biggest energy consumption material in any building anywhere is going to be the air conditioning system. And in Germany, I mean, I usually tell my team, look, it's going to be hot 3 weeks per year. We're going to have temperature above 28 degrees, so we probably don't need to put air conditioning system in our building. In actual fact, most of the tenants, including the ones that are requesting green building certificates, they actually have the air condition as a precondition for them to lease a building. And so there is also this kind of this contradiction. And actually one of the study we've made with the think tank, we asked tenants exactly that question. Do you think your employee would be prepared to give away part of their comfort in exchange to a more sustainable building? And the answer was, you know, probably 50-50 yes and 50-50 no. But if you have run an organization and you've been dealing with HR, you know that as a manager, if you have 50% of your organization which is against something, you're just not going to fight that. It's a fight you're not going to win. So you're absolutely right. There is some element of, and this is where all the contradiction is. What I try to tell my team when we speak about sustainability is, at the end of the day, there is no right or wrong. It's all a question of balance. It's all a question of finding the middle way between, you know, what's going to be acceptable, what is ideal, and what's going to be acceptable. And you need to go for the acceptable. It's not perfect. It's not going to tick all your boxes. You need to be aware of how much not perfect you are. So you need to know how much CO2 you're emitting. You need to know how much more energy that you could have saved you're actually using. But trying to go to the extreme is always the wrong answer. And trying to find the middle ground is probably the right answer. And I'm a big believer in that. And we're going to go further if we not try to be extreme, and we try to find a middle ground, that if we insist on getting the extreme things happening, because it's going to be a disaster at the end of the day. And for me, green building was also part of the same argument, or some of the ratings that we have. You know, we submit rating for indices like DJSI, so Dow Jones Sustainability Index, and other things. And those guys always come up. I mean, they have their view of the world, and they want you as a company to do what they think is right, even if it doesn't necessarily apply to you. But you just need to do that. And I think this kind of extremism in the way is not right. It's more about the path that you're taking and trying to make sure that you always strike a reasonable balance between, you know, comfort and sustainability, because finance and making decent return and making extreme returns. And it's always a question of balance. And I think the balance is what's going to get you successful over the long term.
So we got a couple really good questions in the Q&A I'm going to ask you here, Olivier. So, you know, one comment that I like a lot says it seems like, you know, maximizing the life of a building is crucial, in the sense that you're sort of amortizing the embedded carbon over the sort of the longer lifespan of the building. So how does building longevity factor into your thought process? And when you're doing your financial analysis in the US, it's sort of depending on your execution, sort of anywhere from a 3 to 10 year analysis. Are you looking at holding things longer than that because of the work you're putting into it? I mean, what's your thought there?
So we have two underwriting when we buy a building. We have a traditional 5 to 10 year underwriting that show us where we are with the market. And we have what we called a life cycle analysis, where we assume we're going to be holding the asset forever. And we do not buy an asset if we don't believe we can hold it forever, and we're not going to sell it anywhere. I think what the question says, it's absolutely right. You need to maximize the lifetime of existing building. And the way we look at it is, for us, the description that we usually take is a building is like a theater. You have the structure of the theater, which is here. You have the technical equipment within the theater, and what you need to change to please the tenant is essentially the layout of the stage. And so you need to build a building where all your infrastructure is going to remain forever, but you're going to be extremely flexible to be able to have a play of Shakespeare on Monday and then a play about Star Wars on Tuesday. And so, and you need to be able to change the scenery, which is the layout and the look and feel, without necessarily going too much into the building fabric. Typically, and this is usually sounds kind of completely crazy in the world where we argue you should not put technology in the building, because the technology is what makes your building obsolete. So if your objective is to maximize the lifetime of your building, you should have the least technology possible embedded into the building. You can add technology to it once the building is built, but it should be a plug and play technology. It should not be embedded in the infrastructure, in the superstructure. If you need to destroy the building to actually take out the technologies, then you have the wrong design of the building. You put a facade in your building, which is using tons of sensors, etc. I mean, it's the fastest depreciating assets that's gonna drive the depreciation of your building. So the more, if technology depreciates over 5 or 6 years time or 10 years time, then your building is going to depreciate over 10 years time. And if your objective is to maximize the lifetime of your building, you should limit the technology to the maximum extent possible. And I know that this sounds crazy in the world in which we live, where technology is driving everything, but I'm absolutely convinced, and this is what we tell, we only use technology in our buildings if there is no alternative way to do it. I mean, typically, we always favor natural ventilation to mechanical ventilation, because you will always be able to use a window and open a window, whereby your mechanical ventilation is not going to fit the standard 10 or 15 years down the road. I mean, a very interesting example, which I use all the time with our investor right now, in the COVID situation. In alstria portfolio, we don't have a problem of tenants moving up the elevator and needing to go to the 50th floor, because we don't have a 50th floor. Our building are only 5-story height, and you can always use the stairs to get to your office. And so sometimes the very old technology still works very, very well, and you don't necessarily need to replace it. So I 100% subscribe to that. But beyond the underwriting, I think there's also the need to think about what do you put in your building, and making sure that the thing you put in are not going to accelerate the depreciation and reduce the life cycle of that asset.
I mean, so can you offer an example of something that is sort of ubiquitous in building technology that would fit the category of rapid depreciation, or whatever the term was used?
So, I mean, typically you look at all the issues that you might have now in the US with the HVAC system, which are recycling air within the building. Those are probably not going to be acceptable post-COVID. And a lot of them are deeply rooted within the building itself. So it's not like you can just take them out and put them out. If you want to change the HVAC system into an office building, sometimes you literally need to deconstruct a substantial part of the building itself. And this is a kind of technology, this is where we always favor natural ventilation, because you don't need, because basically you open the window, you close the window if you want to have more or less ventilation in essence. And there are a number of things. I mean, I always tell my development team is, don't come up with a system where you're going to have a very interesting whatever iPad, or because by the time you deliver the building 3 years down the road, whatever system you've decided to choose is going to be outdated. There is now the voice control system, and the tenant is not going to be willing to have the thing you looked at 3 years before when you were designing your building. What we tend to say is the most advanced technology we have in a building is an elevator. Everything beyond that, we should avoid at any cost, unless there is no alternative. So in our design principle, which is, again, is available online on our website, what we say is you only use technology if there is no alternative, like human-powered thing that you can use to do things. And I think that has to do also with our view that we want our building to last as long as possible, and therefore not to depreciate. We do use technology in plug and play. So something that we use smart meters, for instance, but this is easy to put in and put out. You don't need to, it's not embedded in the fabric of the building. The one I'm talking about is the one that's going to be embedded in the fabric. This is typically, for instance, the facade that's gonna, or the window that close when the sun is there, or open when the sun is there. As you don't know if you've been in one of the meeting room, it's very, very annoying, but because whenever there's a cloud, then all of a sudden all the windows shut down. And whenever there's sun, then you have the light changing all the time. So that's the kind of technology I'm relating to here.
Another great question. It says, people in the environment go hand in hand. How do or could sustainable real estate practices impact or improve socioeconomic issues within our communities? And do you have examples?
I think when you, and I think that's really the great thing in our business is when you design a building and when you retrofit a building, you're literally changing the way the environment in which people live. And that's a great feeling to have. I mean, in Hamburg, we did retrofit a building which is in front of the train station. And that basically improved the surrounding of the train station, and you can see how things are evolving. It's not necessarily related to sustainability, but I think if you do this business, you will see that what you do is going to have a massive impact on people's life in your community for a very long period of time, because the decision you make in the design of your building are going to be long lasting. This is, I mean, one reason why, for instance, when you think about densifying a site, when you think about putting more square meter into one plot of land, you also need to think about the impact it's going to have on the life of the people around you. I mean, in Europe, we have very long and to a certain extent painful public consultation process where literally the public is involved into the planning. But I think it's one of the things that I like about what we do in real estate is that the things that you built are going to have a direct impact on the life of the people around the building. And they're also going to impact directly the life of the people within the building. And again, for a very long period of time. So the decision that you make in terms of design are going to have an impact on the health and well-being of the people who are in the building. And this is something I think you're going to take into consideration much more if you're a long-term owner than if you're a developer. If your business plan is, I need to build as cheap as possible, sell as high as possible, and then I'm not managing the building, then you're probably going to miss all those elements.
In my class, there's a number of Finance 220 students, hopefully on this call. We had a case that we talked about, which is using the Governmental Pension Investment Fund in Japan, a $1.2 trillion fund. And there's a gentleman by the name of Hiro Mizuno who really came in, and he was charged with diversifying the fund out of simply sovereign debt of Japan, right, into equities and other things. And he brought an ESG framework to effectively do that. And as a result, he could sort of drive change through how he allocated capital. So do you see these sources of capital being a potential solution or a, whether it's a carrot or a stick or however you look at it, to sort of prod other other investment firms such as yourselves to do these same kinds of, to employ these same kind of practices?
I think what this fund have done is for me is the most interesting investment strategy I've seen when it comes to ESG. But their thinking is also linked to their size, right? If I'm not mistaken, they're saying basically we own the market. So it's not a systemic risk, it's actually our risks that we have, and we actually need to address it. And I think they're absolutely right in their analysis. What we're missing as company and what other fund managers are missing is we actually have the same risk that we need to address in a similar way and have a similar thinking. It's just that we only see what we are and we only look at our own realm. Their realm is so big that they literally own the market. When you hear that gentleman speaking, he will tell you he cannot diversify. I mean, for him, it's just not possible. He owns everything which is available everywhere. And so addressing climate risk for him is just not an option. And he will be, I'm pretty sure, prepared to take lower returns in order to solve the problem. and I think this is really need to be like a landmark. Everybody needs to be following his lead. I listened to him a few weeks ago speaking, and I thought this was really the most interesting contribution I've heard recently on the climate change situation. And this kind of, I think there is a name, just name of his theory is escaping me, but the idea that it's not a systemic risk that we can just ignore and it's going to take care of itself, but it's something we need to own is really, I think, at the heart of what we're doing as a company, and at the heart of what he's doing at his level. And I really, I mean, again, if some people have missed your class, I really encourage them to go and listen to what he has to say, because it's both fascinating and inspiring.
Well, Olivier, you made my day, because you, in front of my students, indicated I'm actually, teaching them things that are relevant in the world today. So I appreciate that very much. And by the way, we're trying to get, Mr. Mizuno to Georgetown to speak. So if you have any inside connections to him, we would love to get him here as part of this. So I would like to end with just one question here for you. We have a lot of young people on the phone and on the Zoom, or on Zoom. So my parents say on the Zoom, on Zoom. What would you like them to take away from this as the next generation of real estate investors? What should they be thinking about?
That's a tough question. I think, first of all, they're getting into an industry which is going through tremendous changes. And I'm pretty sure that the way they're gonna live through this industry are gonna be different than the one I've been through. I think when I started in this industry, it was all about finance. And I've seen it evolve over time to something which is much more operational, focusing on the assets. To be perfectly honest with you, the first transaction I was doing back in the days, we couldn't care less about what the property manager was doing and what the asset manager was doing, because you were buying an asset, financing it, yield compressing, you were doubling your money. And so what's happening within the asset was really almost irrelevant, at least when I was 20 years old. Today, and my whole career, I've basically shifted my focus from finance to what actually was happening in the asset. And I found that actually much more interesting. The finance part is fun, but it's what's happening in the asset is much more interesting. And maybe this is my engineer background where I'm going back to the roots. It's also fascinating in the sense that, there are also discussion about, real estate landlords need to become more service providers, which trigger a lot of potential consequence in the way you organize yourself. So what I would tell them today is, you are getting in an industry which has been very, very stable for the last 1,000 years. I'm pretty sure like a landlord in Rome was doing pretty much what we're doing 20 years ago. And in the last 20 years, it has been changing so fast. And there is so much change to come ahead that this is really the right time to be here now, because this is where it's going to be enjoyable. This is where there's going to be tons of opportunity, where you're going to be able to invent new business models. And the whole climate change is I think, just one element of all of it. It's an important element. I think it's a structuring element. But there are going to be new kind of jobs that are going to exist in our business. There are going to be new opportunities, and that I found is a very, very interesting time to be in real estate right now, and actually start your career in real estate. The other thing I would tell them is, the first time I heard about sustainability, there was the thing that you're doing that for future generations. And today we're not doing that for future generation, because they are the future generation, and there's no future generation that's not going to be impacted by climate change. So I hope that they will be able to force us to do more, and then also embrace the fight and help us to get it through.
Excellent. Olivier, you did not disappoint. We're actually contemplating a rule that we call the Olivier standard, which is a standard we apply to any future speakers. They have to meet your standard of interest and provocativeness for us to bring them to Georgetown. So we certainly appreciate what you're doing, and we appreciate you being involved. And man, we'd love to figure out a way to be involved with you and Austria long term with our students and and research and convening and a variety of other things. So thank you so much for being here, sir.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for having me, and good luck, everybody, and stay safe.
And thank you to everybody from the Georgetown side that helped to get this up and running and out of the ground. Great success. Thank you for everybody who joined us today. So we're going to close for now, and have a great day.